supplementary lectures and things that I wasn't able to kind of really squeeze into the normal, just kind of training videos that we have. So they're gonna, we're gonna have some like little demos, and then just kind of just lectures on things that are kind of really important and things you want to keep in mind when building environments, when you are kind of trying to break into the industry, or kind of like essentially sidestep from one job to a next. Things that you will want to keep in mind, hopefully things that will help you become a better artist, and things that will help you become a better employee. So the more questions you ask, the better, because, I don't know what exactly it is all of you don't know. And so, if we don't get a lot of questions, then, it'll just be kind of what I feel like and what I see people struggling in, and things that I think could help everyone out. But if you all have a lot of questions and you're like, hey, what about this? And then I can definitely answer those in case you're struggling. And to clear up anything between the form section here on the class page and the live Q&A. So the form is great if you have any kind of like questions that you really need answered right away. Those, I'll be checking these and kind of answering these as they kind of come up. For the Q&A stuff, this is if you can't make it to the Q&A, or you just want to ask your questions a little bit early. It's always great because then it allows me to kind of just prepare and make sure that I have all the relevant information for you. As I don't know if any of you have ever done live teaching demos, but there are numerous times where you're doing the most simple thing, and then for some reason, you just start drawing a blank, and then everything goes wrong, and your demo or what you were talking about falls apart. And that's never fun, because then you have to kind of like pause and then be like, okay, we'll check this out next week. So it is always great to have these questions here early, especially if you can't make it to any of the Q&As. All the live Q&As are recorded, and they are put up by the CGMA team within 24 hours. So it should all be there, and you should have all of the Q&As and access to all of your homework submission stuff for up to 6 months, I think it is. Maybe it's a year. I'm not exactly sure what the time frame is. So because I wanted to mention that, as I know not everyone here that is taking the class is actually following along with the 10-week kind of structured course. They are kind of taking it at their own pace. Some people are just even watching the videos and then building an environment on their own, due to numerous circumstances. I obviously know life gets in the way. There's people have jobs, families, friends, all these kind of things. Of course, we ideally want to see people trying to follow along, hitting each week, hitting each assignment, and then kind of rounding out the entire course in the 10-week fashion, getting a great portfolio piece out of that. But I understand that it's not realistic for everyone, especially if you are managing, kind of a 40-hour week job. So if that is the case, don't stress out about it. You have access to all of the content for, I know, at least 6 months. It could be a year. And so that can be really great if you aren't kind of, I guess, turning in assignments each week. Is, you can still ask questions in the forum, in the live Q&A. You can still come to the live Q&As, ask questions, even if you're not submitting each week. So don't be discouraged about, if you miss a week, or, you miss a few weeks and you feel like, oh, I should like not participate in the class. No, please keep participating in the class, whether it is asking questions or, kind of anything in the live Q&A. And just wanted to make it clear, even once this class is done, once the 10 weeks are done, I'll still always be here for all of my students. I love to see any kind of progress that anyone's making, seeing updated scenes. I've had students in the past kind of show me the new environments they're building, or kind of after the 10 weeks were over, they kind of kept going on their environment, polishing it up, adding a little bit more. And so I love to see that stuff. So don't worry if, the 10 weeks are over and you're like, okay, well, that's it. You guys can always still email me, kind of at this CGMA email. I'll always be there. You know, kind of, it'd be great to just see where you all take your environments. David asks, will you be going over work in progress in the WIP section in the live Q&A, or is that just for questions? So the work in progress stuff generally, or at least the way kind of CGMA was explained to me, is they wanted the work in progress section to be where students kind of post what they're working on to ideally foster other students to help participate and kind of leave comments themselves. I've seen that work, you know, only once in one quarter, where people were posting kind of work in progresses constantly and other students posting on there, because that's a really great skill to have, is to be able to actually give feedback to others on your on work that isn't your own. And one of the great things about that is it engages you more with your kind of classmates and your peers. And you know, that is kind of what an environment artist really needs to excel in, is to be able to kind of work with others, because when you are working on a team, you are working with a lot of other artists, and you need to be able to give kind of constructive criticism to, you know, not only yourself but to others. And so it's always kind of a really good skill to have. I definitely still look at, you know, all the work in progress stuff that kind of comes up. But generally, I'm going to leave my feedback for the homework submissions. Let's see. Drew asked, Anthony, do you use Discord much? We have a nice little server with 9 of us sharing and collaborating. So for the thing with Discord, I don't use it a ton. And one of the things for this class in particular is that CGMA wants any of the kind of questions that I'm answering, any of the questions that you guys want to ask me, be kept to the forum here. They're totally cool with you using Discord, especially amongst the students, to kind of, you know, kind of collaborate, share your stuff, ask questions like that. But they want everything that pretty much I answer in terms of questions kept on the forum, so they can always have a record of that, and just so that any other student can check it out if they're not on the Discord. So that's the only unfortunate part with that. I definitely highly recommend a Discord. You know, we've had probably 2 of them going before in 2 of the other classes, and it seemed like, you know, the students really enjoyed that. So I always think that's really cool. But yeah, unfortunately, they want me to just basically answer any of the questions kind of here, so they can always have a record of it, and other students can see that who don't kind of want to participate in the Discord. Because, you know, I know you mentioned that you have 9 of you in the Discord. There are 20 people, or maybe 19 in the class. But yeah, so that is the reason. But it is always, I think, a really cool way to kind of really share your stuff with other people in the class, and kind of like learn off them. You know, when I was in school, that was very much how I pretty much did most of what I actually learned, was actually working with, you know, the friends I had in school, and just kind of, you know, just talking with them, just kind of ping-ponging ideas off them. Because, you know, no matter how much you work with just like one-on-one with like a teacher, or, you know, even on just yourself, you know, kind of having that collaborative environment, getting multiple different points of view from other artists is going to broaden your horizon, because you're going to have one set of kind of viewpoints. I'm going to have my own set of viewpoints. And the more kind of different perspectives that you're getting on your environment, the different backgrounds of people that you're getting to join in the discussion of, you know, kind of how your art is looking, what your environment is really doing, it's going to give you a much broader sense of what could be possible in your environment. All right, let's see if there's any other questions. I think they were just all about the Discord. Yeah, it looks like it. Okay, and then just to let you guys know, of course, you can ask questions here in the live Q&A kind of thread. You know, create a thread, ask some questions, but also feel free anytime during the live Q&As to ask questions here in the chat. I'll try to remember to read them out loud, because I don't think it shows up, the chat. I don't think the chat shows up in the recorded videos. Pretty sure it doesn't. So I'll try to remember to actually read them out loud. Okay, so let's see, what else? We were talking about the live Q&As. the forums. That's right. And then for homework, just wanted to go over this, as I know we had Ryan and someone else, believe it was Igor, had an issue where they said they uploaded their stuff, but they weren't able to get feedback. So when I come on to kind of the submission page, this is essentially what I see. Normally it looks like this. And so if an assignment hasn't been uploaded, I can't click on anything. But once you upload an assignment, there's like a little photo here. I can easily click on them. If it doesn't have it, I can't click on it, and I can't leave any feedback. That's why if I ever allow any late submissions, you always still have to kind of like upload at least something on this page, because this is what I click on to, upload your feedback and be able to post this review. If I can't click on it like this, then I can't open up a page like this to give feedback. So for Ryan and Igor, I'll open up a late submission for both of you, but definitely going to want to try and make sure we get them in on time. If you ever have an issue where it's not showing up for you, make sure you hit up the CGMA tech support, as I have no control over how the website works. Like, all I can do is allow late submissions and kind of be able to click on them. We've had people in the past where they've had issues, and I know that it's kind of like, oh, I can't submit my assignment even though they've done it at the correct time. And what happens is then I can just allow a late submission and still be able to get those in there. But of course, you do have to realize, like, I am working a 40-hour-a-week job and we are heading into crunch, so I can't be allowing late submissions too far down the road. I'll be able to record the feedback, right after we're done with this live Q&A. But just if you ever have an issue like that, make sure you just let the CGMA techs know, and they will be able to fix that, hopefully for you in the future. Let's see, Ryan asks, uploading images to the gallery, could you click on mine? Sure, I'll just click on it. Oh, okay, so I think that was the issue. There's no image. It shows up as if there isn't anything there. Okay, I can click on both of these. Okay, so that's good to know. I've never seen that before. So make sure you guys upload an image then, because otherwise if I see this, I'm just going to assume I can't click on it, as these I can't click on. And these just looked like they were not turned in assignments. So yeah, I'll get those done tonight for both of you. But yeah, just make sure you upload an image and everything. And if you ever have an issue where you can't upload your zip file and you need to email it to me, always make sure you at least upload an image on here. Because again, as I said, if I can't click on this, then I can't open that page. And also, it'll show that there is an assignment submitted, because it just doesn't tell me if there is an assignment or not, even with this. So that will be, helpful and good to know. Because again, if, you can't upload your zip file, but you could give me a Google Dropbox or a Google Drive file, as long as you can upload a single image so that I can attach the video feedback, that's really all I need. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing for everyone. Yeah. Okay, so what I wanted to go over first before we dive into these live Q&A questions, because hopefully it might clear up some things, is to kind of go over a little bit more in depth what we're planning to kind of go over in this class. As a lot of times, especially in the early days of the class, we'll get questions that I want to kind of save until we're going over a week, like kind of a week that we are going over that material. I know that Frank here asked about kind of some like rock sculpting, like what's the best way to start kind of going about creating rocks like this? How would you go about making this modular, and everything? So for week 3, we're going to start going into rock sculpting. So things like that, I'm going to want to save, and just so all of you have a better idea. That way, if you have a question about, say, like foliage and foliage creation. You'll know the week that we're going to be going over that and know what kind of we're going to be going over in terms of all the foliage that we're going to be creating. And that way, so if you have any of those questions, that you can be like, okay, cool, you can start planning for those kind of weeks, as well as kind of planning out what you want for your environment. As one of the things is, we only really have like an hour-ish for the live Q&As, and I want to be able to make sure that we get to everything that is very pertinent for each of these weeks. And then before we jump into this, I wanted to also mention that for the live Q&As, you don't need to just ask questions that are related to kind of this class. If you have any questions that are related to the industry in general, kind of the processes that we do at Naughty Dog or other studios, or just kind of questions about art tests, things like that, feel free to ask those. I'll be sure to answer all of them as best I can. As I know, a lot of people are always kind of curious about how things are done at different studios and how they differ from kind of creating your own personal environment to working in a bigger team and, things like that. All right. And I'll upload this just kind of little notepad with everything that we'll be doing, so you can always refer back to it and you don't need to open this live Q&A video. But just for a quick rundown, in week 2, we're going to be learning Unreal's landscape system, kind of creating our base landscape shader that we're going to be adding to throughout the class, kind of figuring out how we're going to be blocking in and building out our environment. In week 3, it's all going to be about rock sculpting. We're going to dive into ZBrush. We're going to make kind of a large 360 kind of degree rock that you can utilize throughout your environment. We're going to, just go over some quick low poly UVing tips and everything for kind of creating that. Week 4 is going to be a continuation on ZBrush. We're going to be making some rock piles and a tiling rock texture. Week 5 is going to be advanced shaders in Unreal. Advanced, just kind of additions that you can add to make your shaders look as best as possible. In week 6, it's going to be about foliage creation. We're going to go over kind of like the basics and then just some, kind of more advanced stuff. In week 7, we're going to be kind of going over the different ways we can populate our foliage inner scene, how we want to kind of start to clump our foliage up in our scene to kind of give it an aesthetically pleasing look, and the different ways we can use the foliage tool. In week 8, we're going to be that's a great time to work on your man-made assets, kind of focus in on your points of interest, as you're going to have a lot of those man-made assets created. Week 9 is going to be all about lighting in post. And week 10 is going to be kind of about cameras, screenshots, websites, art stations, how best to present your work. All right, so that's just like a quick rundown. Now I just wanted to give a little bit more detailed explanation of what we're going to be doing each of those weeks. So in week 2, when we are working with our landscape shader or landscape systems, we're going to be really kind of blocking out our environments. We really want to understand how to kind of build out the world, how we want to create interesting flows through our environment to kind of create an area that has a lot of kind of touchstones that we want to draw the player or the viewer from one area to the next, and how we can kind of lead a player around any one of our given scenes. We're going to be going into creating the landscape shader. If you've never used Unreal, unfortunately, it's probably the most complex shader to kind of really work on. But I kind of go through a very step-by-step process of how to kind of set up the basic parts of the shader. And then, as we go along throughout the class, you can keep adding more and more complexity to it. So that's going to kind of be all of week 2. In week 3, again, as I mentioned, we're going to be doing rock sculpts. So I know ZBrush is kind of, it's a really difficult thing to kind of really learn. Again, you don't have to use ZBrush. You can also use Mudbox, but understanding any kind of 3D sculpting program is going to be huge for your toolkit when building pretty much any kind of asset. It can also work for even hard surface stuff, adding extra detail to things, creating stylized assets. So, we're going to be going over kind of all the basics of how to kind of utilize ZBrush, use ZBrush, and then actually creating a bunch of rocks. As rocks are probably one of the most difficult things to create just because they're so organic, and a lot of people just don't really like to make them because they're very difficult. They take a while. A lot of people kind of just prioritize too much the small little rocky details, and they don't get their big shapes in there. So we're going to go over practices on how to do that, how to quickly make a low poly for your rock, kind of some tips on where you want to be putting your seams for clean bakes, and then how to kind of just sculpt 2 extra kind of boulders that you can add to your scene as well. So one of the big reasons for this is we want to get you sculpting as much as possible so that you get more comfortable creating rocks, creating assets in ZBrush, as the thing that's going to help you create better rocks is just kind of pumping out a bunch, getting really used to sculpting, understanding what is going to create an interesting silhouette, what's going to be too much noise and everything. So week 3 is going to be all about ZBrush. Week 4 is going to be continuation of that. As I mentioned, it is kind of a difficult program to learn, and learning more about what you can do with ZBrush is going to be really powerful and going to allow you to create a lot of assets that can fill up an organic environment pretty quickly. So we're going to do a kind of ZBrush rubble pile. We can utilize some of the rocks that you'll be able to create in week 3, or you can be able to just kind of create a rubble pile from scratch. We'll also be going over the process of how you can sculpt a tiling texture. We're going to be showing that off, kind of how to sculpt a tiling rock texture, as all of our rocks are going to be primarily using a tiling texture for a lot of the detail. So one of the things that environment artists do is they utilize a lot of tiling textures. So if you see here in the scene, pretty much everything is utilizing tiling textures. Nothing is just pretty much one-to-one completely mapped. The reason for that is, as an environment artist, you have to create this entire world that the player is going to run around in, and you have a very limited budget. And texture memory is probably the biggest limiting factor. Polygons are really not. So kind of when you're worried about polygons, you can get away with a lot more polygons than you can get away with really big textures. And for, kind of rocks like these big ones here up here on these kind of cliff mountains, if you were to kind of uniquely unwrap these and have all this detail be kind of like a one-to-one map on this giant rock here, when you get up close to it, it would be super blurry. It would look really great from afar, but we want to be able to create assets that look really nice far away, as well as when you get up close to them, because in most environments, you can generally get up pretty close to any asset. And so to do that, you need to utilize quite a lot of tiling textures. The one thing that we can do to still give any of these assets that really nice kind of sculpted look and all that detail that we want to have in them is we can utilize a unique one-to-one normal map and then overlay that on top of our tiling textures. And so that's what we're going to be kind of learning how to do. It's a really good kind of trick to get the essential ZBrush sculpted look from our rocks while utilizing tiling textures to get the most amount of detail out of our textures and out of our assets. So that might be a little confusing for some of you. We'll definitely go over it a lot more in the kind of coming weeks, but that's pretty much why we're going to be learning a lot of ZBrush, because we're going to want to be sculpting these rocks to be able to bake down these normal maps, but then we're going to be utilizing tiling textures that we can sculpt once again in ZBrush to be able to create, essentially any size rock that we really need, while also limiting or keeping things in an actual production environment kind of pipeline. We want to make sure that what you're being taught in this class is also going to be able to directly apply to an actual production environment job. So that's why I'm going to be stressing modularity, utilizing tiling textures, creating advanced shaders, as these are all things that are going to actually be usable in a job and a production environment. Just kind of creating a really beautiful scene when it is done in a way that would never realistically run in a production environment. Generally isn't going to go over too well. It's going to look really great, but it quickly will come across that, this is something that you can only do because you uniquely unwrapped every single thing in your scene. So we're going to want to try and teach how to utilize tiling textures and advanced shaders to be able to create still absolutely beautiful environments, but keeping them within an actual production kind of spec and guideline. For week 4, if you are more comfortable utilizing a program like Substance to create your tiling textures, you can totally do that. That's totally fine. I just want to be able to show off how you can create textures in ZBrush. At Naughty Dog, we kind of have, it's kind of a very much like split down the middle. We have a bunch of artists who only sculpt things pretty much in ZBrush and then use Substance for kind of their diffuse textures. And then we have other people who pretty much only use Substance now. So it's kind of a mixed bag. Either way, sculpting rocks or sculpting tiling textures in ZBrush is going to just give you a bit more kind of experience in ZBrush. It's going to, kind of give you that practice. It's going to allow you to really understand how to sculpt micro details, kind of medium to micro details for those tiling textures, where when you're sculpting your rocks, you're going to be focusing more on your primary shapes and your secondary shapes over your kind of smaller tertiary shapes. Week 5, oh wait, there was a question here. Clarence asked, my scene has a river, so I want to know how to make a realistic water shader. We're teaching water shaders. For water shaders, no, we will not be covering that. I can give you a link to where you can check out how to make a water shader. Water shaders are extremely technical, very complex shaders. They're very advanced. They require a lot of math kind of calculations, way outside of my scope of understanding. They're at a studio, they're always going to be handled by either a technical artist, a programmer, or an FX artist, generally kind of a combination of all three of them, unless you're making kind of very simple water or kind of maybe some cell shaded water. But I will definitely show you where you can have some options for the water. There's like the Unreal preset water that is totally free. There is the Unreal library water, which is a lot better. It's a little bit more expensive. It might slow down your computers a little bit, but it still looks really great. And there's a lot of things you can edit. And then there's also water that you can buy as well. But honestly, I think just the free water, like the starter content water in Unreal, like if you kind of like add the starter content here, wherever it is, content packs, starter content, it has a water shader in there that works pretty well. But we'll also kind of go over in the Unreal, it's the Unreal Learning tab. I guess it doesn't work right now. Oh, there we go. So there is an Unreal water kind of pack here, this water planes. It's got a lot of water planes in there that you can utilize for free, and they look really great. So we'll kind of go over that when we go over a lot of the water stuff and kind of like rivers and stuff, and how rivers can be really, really powerful for your scenes and how they can add a lot to your environments, not only because they add a lot of nice directionality in your environment, a lot of really nice leading lines in your environment, but they also can add great material changes in your scene, be it from, kind of the dampening effect of water along a shoreline, the different types of plants and assets that can be along a kind of shoreline, and the stories you can tell there. So we'll kind of go over that in week 8. And I know Frank asked for the river. He asked if I made the river myself. No, I did not. It's this river plugin tool that I got off the Unreal Marketplace. It's really cool. I have no idea how to make any of these spline rivers in Unreal. They're extremely complex and require a lot of blueprint work, but it's a kind of like just a $15 download for this one river tool. If you don't want to go for the river tool that I'll show off in week 8, there is, of course, the Unreal Water, just the Unreal Water planes. You can use those. They work really well, especially when you're just kind of creating just kind of screenshots for your environment. If you were making this to be an actual game, then generally you're going to want to have some kind of river tool. That way, you can kind of place down these splines. And let's see, I think I haven't updated it, so it might be broken a little bit. But you can kind of easily change kind of the scale and everything. Yeah, I don't think it's been updated. That's the only thing. You have to just make sure that you kind of update any of these marketplace tools that you download. Otherwise, they can get kind of outdated with if you are updating your engine version as well. But I'll show that off. I think it's a really cool river tool and everything. It has like a little bit of waterfalls on it as well. Yeah, so that's a pretty cool little tool. Is there anywhere you can buy my UE4 scene? No, there isn't, unfortunately, because of using just like some assets from friends in it, just to kind of like demo off things, and as well as this like river tool. So I didn't really know the way to kind of release that publicly or kind of sell it. So unfortunately, no, there's not. But if there's anything you want to see or see me demo off in the scene, you totally just ask and I will kind of show it off. A lot of the stuff that we kind of go over in the class is what you're going to be seeing in this scene, as well as, and like this scene is a lot of things were just made for the demo. So like just have some random, just like garbage around the scene. So it was done in basically a way just to really kind of show off a lot of the techniques that we're going to be showing off in this class. But yeah, so if there is ever anything that you want to see and you're like, oh, can you show me how you did this and that? We can easily go over anything and kind of break down this stuff. All right, so week 5 is going to be kind of advanced shader techniques. So these are going to be a whole bunch of different things that we can add to shaders to kind of create really complex looking environment assets, things that can show off a lot of really powerful tools like kind of slope shaders, which are kind of probably one of the coolest things, as it can really make any of your modular assets or any of your assets become really easily modular and look very different. So if you don't know what slope shaders are, or I think Unreal, as Unreal refers to them, they refer to them as like up vector shaders. It's where you can kind of place, or you can kind of tell an asset to always have something falling on any kind of direction. So for example, like this rock here, any way I rotate this rock, it's always going to have snow on the top of it. You can also do this for many other things like moss kind of growing on the top of a rock, sand growing on there. Maybe some small pebbles are always kind of falling on the tops of these rocks. And of course, you don't have to do it on just the tops of the rocks. You can also do it on the sides. So maybe you wanted to have the moss always growing on the sides of your trees because you're making like a forest, and you always want the moss on kind of like the north side. You can easily do that. Or maybe you have a lot of damage and you always want it to be kind of maybe on one side because an explosion happened. And so then all the pieces that you scatter around will always have damage kind of on one side. So shaders like that are extremely powerful. We'll go over kind of vertex blending tools as well. And so this is what's going to really help turn our assets from, how we can utilize these tiling textures to a usable degree, where we're painting basically away different parts of our kind of texture, and we're getting, kind of different looks. So, we had this rock, had all these kind of like chunky details in here. And then, I can easily go in there, vertex paint away some different colors in there, and get, kind of completely different looks throughout this asset. That way we can utilize a lot of modular textures, or a lot of modular assets, and create these different looks. So it can become really powerful. You can even remove a lot of the kind of slope shader that you have on there. And then so this rock can look very different than, a rock that you might have right next to it. So we'll go over the process of how to kind of create advanced shaders like that. They can add a lot to your assets and kind of really allow you to get away with a lot of the modularity that you're going to need to be building these environments out of. Because again, as I said, environments require you to utilize a lot of modular assets and a lot of tiling textures, because you are kind of constrained by texture memory for your levels. Like at work, pretty much the budget that the character art team has for, all the NPCs in the level is generally higher than the environment budget that we kind of get to make our environments. It ranges, of course, on whatever game you're working on, but we always want our characters to have really high resolution, high texture quality, and having a lot of different characters. And so that's, of course, going to make your environment budget shrink quite a lot. So you have to kind of think of clever ways that you can get away with utilizing less assets and utilize modularity and tiling textures to be able to get the same high quality fidelity out of your scenes with actually using less. Week 6, again, it's going to be about foliage creation. We're going to be creating like grass, weeds, ivy. We'll kind of go over how at Naughty Dog we do a lot of our ivy, and as well as kind of creating some roots for our scenes, and how we can use in Maya, we can use the joint tool to be able to allow us the flexibility of creating a lot of different kind of roots that can wrap around objects, such as like rocks, or kind of just around the terrain itself, and utilizing joints to get a lot of modularity out of our roots that we're going to be building. It's something that is really common at Naughty Dog, so we use it a lot. Of course, just open ArtStation real quick so I can kind of show you that we kind of utilize it to kind of create a lot of different things. So, obviously with like a lot of trees, we have a lot of roots that just kind of wrap around a lot of different assets, kind of like this tree bridge that I have here. These were all kind of created modularly, so I didn't need to essentially hand make this entire like tree root bridge. I was able to kind of just make a few roots and then utilize joints in Maya to really just kind of bend any of my assets to kind of conform around and create all these things modularly. Week 7, we're going to go over the way that we can utilize Unreal to create a lot of our foliage. So there's going to be kind of 2 ways that we can create or add our foliage to our scenes. The first one is going to be kind of like utilizing the foliage painter tool, where we can, kind of create different settings, paint down foliage pretty easily. It's great for when you are like, okay, I really want to hand place a lot of my detail in a specific area. That way you can kind of go in there, hand place a lot of really nice detail, and really kind of hand sculpt a scene We're also then going to go over how we can add to our landscape the ability to spawn assets dynamically. And this is great for, especially for foliage, especially if you have any kind of like wide open plains or any areas that you want to kind of just paint down different assets. Oh, I guess I'm gonna have to let it compile the shaders here real quick while it's bugging out. But basically, we can utilize where we can drive essentially asset placement based on whatever texture we're painting onto our landscape. So if I paint a grass texture down, then it will start to spawn grass assets, and you can add a whole bunch of different assets to this. And so you can kind of have it spawning a bunch of different different bits of grass, maybe even some trees. We can spawn some small pebbles and rocks. And the great thing about this is that we can also set up all the kind of culling distances so that, far off in the distance where we're not seeing that grass anymore, we can have it kind of easily fade out. It's a really cool, powerful tool. So, if I paint in some texture here, not that one. Weird, I can't select anything. Let me try this again. All right, so you can see that we can easily just be painting down a texture right here, and then it's spawning a whole bunch of grass on there. You probably are not going to want to be spawning all this grass where this snow is. You might want to have a grass texture for it, but we can also do the same for some of these rocks. Like if we fly over here and we just start painting down some of this rock texture, we're going to have some of these little stones being just populated right away. This can give us a really nice base to kind of really start out on for our environments. If you're like, okay, I always want to have grass here, or I always want to have some of these small stones painted there, that can be a great way to just kind of start out. And then, you kind of come in there with the painting brush and actually kind of just then paint in whatever other elements and assets you need. So over how we can do that, one is through the foliage painting tool, and then one is what we're going to be adding to our landscape to dynamically spawn assets on there. So that will be week 7. Week 8, I always think is a kind of a great time to really work on any of your man-made assets. It is kind of near the very end of the class, and it gives you a time to kind of really focus in on your points of interest, whether your points of interest in your scene are man-made elements or they are kind of points of interest that are organic elements. So you don't have to do a man-made element in your scene. It is always nice to have something in there, but if you are at a point where you're like, I'm kind of running out of time, I don't really have a lot of kind of time to create a bunch of man-made assets, then I always think the man-made assets are some of the easiest things to kind of just cut away from your project to allow you more time to focus in on the organic elements. And I believe I mentioned in everyone's kind of homework assignment that you definitely really want to scale your man-made assets back as much as possible. We want to make sure that there's something you can kind of easily create in a week. We don't want them to kind of take up all of your time, as we do still want to focus in on creating a great looking organic scene. Week 9 is going to be all about lighting and post-processing. We'll go over kind of like light map creation. We'll go over how we want to set up a mood for our scene, how we can really kind of dial in and kind of really get that mood there, how we can harmonize our color palette, and we can do some post-processing effects so we can get some really cool looks. Let's see if I have any of these set up right now. That one's enabled. All right, I don't think I have any of them set up right now, but just to give a quick example of the different kind of post-processing that we can get, and we can really change up things. So as we can see, kind of like in some of these areas, we can get these really nice light shafts in some of these kind of spaces. These like screenshots are all taken from kind of the same environment, but we can easily get some very different looks. This kind of very foggy, heavy fog area is basically just right in this space, and it's just kind of playing around with some of the post-processing settings. And then here's just a reverse basically of that shot, kind of here by this little lake, where again, just taking some different post effects in there, a little bit of different lighting to get these kind of really different effects for our environment. So we'll go over how we can really do that and create a lot of different moods and different feelings for our environment, and how that can really add a lot of dynamic feeling to your environment just by simply changing some of the post-processing in your scene. You can kind of really get a different feeling in your environment. Okay, yeah, so I think here was one of the post-processing volumes we have in there. So we're getting all this kind of crazy light and fog in there. So I didn't have to make like a different environment at all to really get this. All I had to do was kind of tweak around with some of the post-processing, some of the fog settings, some of the volumetric fog, and just so I can get an entirely different mood out of this kind of environment already. So you only have to really make one environment, and you can get a lot of different looks out of it with your post-processing. And this can give your environments a lot of leverage and a lot of leg room to kind of essentially give your portfolio a larger expanse of items to really kind of look at without having to basically build an entire new environment. You can just use your post-processing, your lighting to kind of get that feeling. Week 10 will be the final week. We'll be kind of finishing up things. We'll be really composing our scenes. We'll be setting up camera positions. We'll go over the importance of kind of how you want to frame your shots, what to kind of include in your portfolio, how to even build a portfolio, as it is, something I know a lot of people still struggle with, and how you can add in these assets, how to create an ArtStation portfolio to really maximize the amount of exposure you can get from your scenes, and how best to kind of show off your work towards potential employers or just people that you want to kind of see your artwork and get the most amount of eyes on it. So we'll kind of go over that, and week 10 will definitely be all about, or a lot about, kind of just the final stages of kind of really finishing up your scenes, perfecting your portfolio pieces, how to really make your portfolio stand out and kind of show it off and show how you are a valuable member to any team that is looking to hire you, and kind of what you can expect from the industry as a whole. So yeah, a lot to kind of cover in 10 weeks. So there it is, kind of like what we're kind of going to be going over. It is quite a lot to cover. So we'll hoping everyone kind of can stick up with the deadlines. But again, if you do miss a deadline, don't be discouraged about it. You can always submit the next week, kind of, and hopefully catch up. Sometimes you might have a week where you're like, well, I just kind of fell behind or work got in the way. And I've had people been able to kind of catch up easily. And some people just were never really able to kind of catch up all the way. It doesn't mean that you can't still submit your assignments. And if you're like, hey, I wasn't able to work on my scene for like 3 weeks, and then, you submit what you have at like maybe like week 8 or 7, and you're like, well, I could only get to maybe sculpting rocks for this quarter or whatever. That's also fine. Whatever you can get in, just make sure you get that in. And, if you do ever fall behind, and the class does end at week 10, again, you can email me, send me any updates to the stuff you're working on. I'd love to see it. Won't be able to do the video feedback, but I can still write you some feedback, just kind of jot down some notes of what I think can help improve your scene. So never get discouraged about any kind of time frame that you're under. Work at a speed that is good for you, and don't stress out too much about it. Because, like I said, 10 weeks to make an environment is not a lot of time, especially if you are learning a lot of these kind of tools that we're going to be going over for the first time. And, when you are building an environment, there's so many tools to actually use. There's so many things to kind of cover that, unfortunately we can only cover so much, and we can only really do so much. So there's so much more you can always add to your environments. We're just trying to get the most amount of environment exposure for all of you in the allotted time we have. All right, so let's kind of go over the final kind of questions here in the Q&A to kind of just really close out this first week. So I know Frank asked about kind of like he was wondering the best way to kind of really start the base sculpting of these rocks. And as I mentioned, this is definitely something we'll kind of be very, very much covering in week 3. So kind of save that for those weeks, as I believe a lot of those kind of questions will be answered. Krista was asking about kind of one of the best ways to approach working with materials that appear near like a waterfall, assuming some parts would get wet kind of on a rock. She was asking, like, would you be creating 2 different shaders, one wet and one dry? So when we go over the advanced shaders in week 5, we'll definitely be going over how we can utilize vertex blending in our kind of singular master shader for something like our rocks, and where we can kind of vertex paint, as I showed up here, where you can kind of vertex paint different textures or different materials. So on these rocks right here that I have kind of like in the water, what you can have on them is you can have different different roughness values on the rock. And so you can get kind of different looks in here. So when you kind of paint, well, that's painting snow, so we don't want snow. Maybe the green channel. So the green channel right here, it's kind of painting away the wetness of the rock. So we'll kind of go over again in week 5 how we can kind of create these advanced shaders that will allow us to kind of get these different looks. And one of the things for something like a rock with water on it, it's kind of a combination of 2 different things that I like to add to kind of like my shaders to get the wet effect on a rock. The first being kind of blending to a different or a lower roughness value, so it is shinier. It's basically going to get a lot more kind of reflectivity to it, so it kind of looks like it's wet, but then also darkening the diffuse or the base color of that asset just by a little, because generally when something gets wet, the it's a rock, whether it's kind of dirt, it's going to get wet. It's going to absorb water. Even rocks are going to absorb some water into them, and then it definitely darkens them. So we'll go over that. You can utilize it on assets, just like this kind of like rock pile, and also you can utilize the same technique on your landscape here. So like we have just kind of like dirt right here where we're like, okay, cool, I have some dirt. But then we'll also go over how we can kind of change that up and add, just with some simple changes like changes in our roughness, darkening it up. I'm basically getting this kind of mud effect here. It's the exact same texture that this dirt is, but changing up the roughness and then, a slight darkening of the base color, without having to add a new texture, is going to give us a lot of versatility in our scene. So basically I'm getting this look of dirt as well as this look of mud from the same tiling textures. And again, that's going to save you on a lot of time from creating new textures. You won't need to necessarily create, a dry dirt texture and a mud texture. You only need to kind of create one texture, and then just kind of mess around with some of the parameters in the shaders to kind of get these looks. And so it can save you not only on texture memory, but also time in kind of creating these assets, because you're always limited by the amount of things you can actually build in any given time, any given deadline that you have. Yeah, flattening the normals also help out as well. Although sometimes, if you do that, it can look a little plasticky. Generally, like if you do have something like dirt or like especially like rocks, it's not going to flatten out the normals on something like your rocks, because the water is still going to fill into those crevices. There was a question, or there was a comment. Honestly, that was one of the things that took me the longest, getting a nice library of homemade shaders. There's a great course on CGMA from Kurt Kupster. Yes, definitely. Kurt has a really great kind of class on kind of advanced shader kind of creation. I think it's like a 6-week class that kind of really dives deep into a lot of things like advanced shaders. So we'll be going over, what we can within the kind of scope of this class. But again, as I mentioned, there is so much to kind of cover to how to build an organic environment. We can only cover so much. We're not going to be able to cover everything that could be done in what you could actually do. We're going to be covering as much as we can, but we won't be able to cover everything. So there is like the texturing and shading for games, I believe it is. There's also, advanced substance art for environments. Those are, I know, just from people that have taken it, they've highly recommended both of those. So those are definitely good ones to look into if you want to just kind of expand your knowledge on them. The texture one is only 3 weeks. Oh, I thought it was like 6. That's actually really nice. Just a small little 3-week class. But yeah, also the texturing and shading for games is great as you go over a lot of kind of advanced materials, probably more than we'll be going over. But if you do have any questions on how to build out any other kind of advanced shaders, just let me know and I will try to cover them as best as I can. Some things, they might just be a little bit out of my realm of, kind of knowledge on how to do them, as, some things like a water shader, again, they require a lot of math and a lot of kind of technical knowledge. So I unfortunately, I just don't know the best way to do it. But one of the great things about the internet is you can always find good examples on other people who have built really nice kind of water shaders, and a lot of times they share on how they kind of created some of those things. All right, Andrew asked, he was asking about how he knows a lot of environments go through iteration with level design. Even though we aren't touching on this during the course, I'd like to ask about it. Does Naughty Dog use any terrain tools like Houdini or World Machines as core parts of their workflow? And do you ever have to end up going back to repaint or recreate details you made in one of the editors once it's kind of like the design has been changed? So if you don't know, Houdini is a very procedural kind of tool that can kind of connect with things like Unreal. Same with World Machine. World Machine is great if you're ever trying to create kind of vista mountains. And so to kind of quickly answer that, no, World Machine and Houdini are not core parts of our tool set that we use at Naughty Dog. Some people have used things like World Machine to create what we refer to as wides. Basically, they're areas outside of the play space that you can never really get to. Generally, World Machine is really great for things like that, things that are seen far off in the distance. But generally, they just don't hold up very well when you're kind of up close to them. They're if you're trying to create a extremely large open game world, it can kind of work well for that. I know like DICE uses it on their Battlefield maps, But kind of when you get into what most game studios do, most game studios are not really utilizing a program like World Machine to kind of create their levels. Because in reality, when it kind of comes down to it, most environments that are being created are generally pretty linear hallways with a bunch of art on them to make them appear like they're not actually linear corridors that you're walking through. And that's your job as an environment artist, to kind of trick the player or the viewer into believing that the space that you're creating is a large living, breathing world while it's still kind of gated off, in a lot of different ways, and utilizing different things like walls of foliage, rock cliffs, kind of impassable rivers. Things like this can all help keep a player funneled into essentially a nice little linear corridor. Now, for games that do use programs like World Machine or are kind of very open world-esque, and that use things like splat maps and height maps to generate their actual terrain, good examples of this are, Battlefield, Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, Red Dead Redemption. All of those kind of large terrain chunks are generally handled by a kind of more senior technical artist who is kind of very much handling a lot of those kind of terrain chunks in general. Generally, the artists are not creating the overall height map that would create this landscape terrain. Is usually done by kind of the technical artists at a studio, because it is such a performance intensive requirement for those large open worlds. The individual artists will kind of have the terrain kind of generated for them, and then they'll go in and kind of adjust things slightly, where they can kind of like paint some mountains, and kind of paint and sculpt some terrain, kind of raising the terrain up and down. But generally, for those big, large open world games, they are not handling the kind of the world, kind of like the overall world kind of creation, like something like this. It's generally handled by a technical artist for all the technical constraints. So anytime anyone asks me if they can make their environment using World Machine, I always say, or I always try to suggest avoiding it as much as possible, because another thing that World Machine suffers from is that it looks great from essentially this view. And it looks great from very far away. But when you start to get up really close, a lot of things start to fall apart. They look a little flat, but it can be used well to generate some really cool terrain like this. But when you are up close, you always do have to remember that you only have a certain amount of kind of vertices in your Unreal terrain landscape. So if we just zoom over here and check out the wireframe. So you can see here these mountains. Unfortunately, the skybox is also shown up, so it's a little bit difficult. But these mountains here only have a certain density in the kind of terrain. And so when you are kind of trying to utilize a really detailed export from something like World Machine, Unreal only has so many points to really make up this landscape. So it can start to feel really polygonal, very flat, especially when you get up close. So the majority of the time at Naughty Dog at work, what we do is we'll create we'll create the mountains with rock assets like these, just kind of modular rocks that become our cliffs, and then we kind of just fit the terrain into wherever we need, and we just don't allow you to get out into any of these areas. And so you have to use kind of clever just placement of assets on where you really need to kind of hide any holes in your terrain, or if you want to kind of utilize this rock asset right here, I'm utilizing it here in this background here. And so it looks like this kind of just large mountain. But if we just fly up here, it's just kind of a floating rock. And unless you have a game where you can like fly a plane or fly a dragon, generally you're always going to be kind of at a player height down here. And so you can only see this kind of cliff from this view here. You're not going to be able to get above here to see, where there's a big hole in the world. So you use a lot of kind of trickery to make some of these areas, again, we refer to them as wides. They're kind of far wide out in the distance to kind of create that look. Here's an example from Uncharted: The Lost Legacy. So this area down here is all of the play space that the characters can go in. It's made up of mostly kind of modular rocks. And then these far off mountains way out here, these were kind of created by World Machine, by an artist that we had who knew how to use World Machine really well. And he created a lot of the kind of wides for all of Uncharted. And so we kind of plop those in the background. They don't have to be as detailed, but they still give that really nice far off distance look. But for the in-game play spaces here, this is all created by modular assets and then just kind of our terrain that kind of seams things together. David asks, how many of you worked on that section? Such an awesome area. Thanks, I really appreciate it. This section was pretty much, in terms of environment artists, it was only myself and then my texture artist, Genesis Parado. So at Naughty Dog, we kind of split things up between a environment artist who handles all the kind of modeling of assets, and then kind of world building. And then we have a texture artist who handles a lot of the kind of fine detail sculpting on assets and kind of creating all of the shaders, either it be kind of in Photoshop, Substance, or ZBrush, and then kind of applying those textures there. So we kind of work very hand in hand. Sometimes I'll have to make some textures. Sometimes they would, like my texture artist would have to make some models. But for the most part, I kind of do all the world building and the asset creation. Of course, with anything like this, a lot of these assets are kind of reuse assets either from previous games that have been retextured or really just kind of slightly kind of readjusted. Some of the things are from other artists at the studios, but for the most part, like all of this was done by myself and our texture artist Genesis. I'm not gonna lie, it was insane. It was way more work than we kind of ever expected to do, and way more crunching than we ever had to do on any project. We're happy with the result, but very unhappy with the kind of production to kind of make all of this entire environment in just a year. But it was a weird kind of project that was starting off really small, and then it just kind of ballooned in scope. And that's often one of the downfalls of a lot of games, is that they start really small and then we're like, oh, we want to make this a full game instead of like a 2-hour DLC, and then you end up having to make a much larger kind of space than you ever thought you would. And things happen, and sometimes you just get stuck kind of really working on absolutely massive areas. So happy with how it turned out, but not happy with how much effort it actually took. David said, I love how there is no feeling of disconnect between the play space and the Vista messages. So like it's one huge area. Can you continue to run through? So well done. Oh, well, thank you. That is definitely one thing that we always try and focus on, is kind of really disguising those gaps between what is a playable space and what is not. It can sometimes be hard when you are getting up to areas where if it's too close to the playable space, it feels like the player can kind of jump out and get into those areas. So you do have to utilize different things to make sure it doesn't feel like the player can get out of your space when they get up close to any of those like kind of cliff walls. We utilize a lot of foliage, a lot of shape language, like really craggly rocks or things that look like they can't be like kind of climbable or you can easily get out. And then it's kind of the process of layering details, kind of, creating a gameplay space in here, and then kind of trying to pull in a lot of elements that you have here in the gameplay space into the kind of further reaches, the kind of further out areas. And so the more you can kind of tie the gameplay space into the areas that are kind of farther away, maybe by just adjusting some of the scale so they seem smaller, so they feel further away, you can kind of give that feeling that, oh, these are all in the same kind of connected space. And then, of course, a lot of it comes from, good lighting, good atmospherics like the fog. So things like atmospherics and lighting are handled by our lighting and our FX team. So those were not done by myself or my texture artist Genesis. So yeah, environments are always kind of really built with a lot of different people. Even when you do the majority of like something like this, like the waterfalls are created by our FX team. All I did was kind of be like, place them, and I'm like, here's where I want my waterfalls. And then again, like our FX team will go in, they'll put all in this atmospheric fog, so it feels like the environment has a lot more layers to it and feels like it has some really nice depth. You have to work really closely with your lighting artist to kind of get areas that you want to kind of read really well. Some areas you want to be really nice and shadowed. Some areas you want to have, kind of a lot of light, and trying to find that good balance of kind of a 50-50 of in sunlight and in shadow. David also asked, if you don't mind asking how long this took, just trying to get my head around 2 people to manage such an area. So it was kind of spent over 9 months. We kind of made this entire environment, but that was like 9 months also crunch as well. So it was probably closer to, like, in terms of hours put in, probably, I don't know, maybe like 14, 16 months, just because we did have to crunch quite an extreme amount. It was probably the most I ever had to crunch, and definitely the most I will ever crunch again. I can't advocate enough for not crunching, because I think it's terrible. It definitely kind of really can lead to a lot of bad habits and a lot of kind of mental stress and strain, and can really hurt, friends, family, relationships, and your desire to actually even want to work on things. So yeah, this was kind of like, I'd always crunched before on things, but never to a degree to kind of finish out this game. And definitely made me see how bad crunch can be. And, we kind of saw it throughout the entire team. And, once the Lost Legacy was over, kind of the desire of a lot of environment artists to kind of start up the next game, it took quite a while for a lot of people to kind of get over the burnout of what Lost Legacy was, just because of how it kind of ballooned from a small DLC to basically an 8-hour game, when we had the amount of people working on it to make basically a, kind of 3 to 4 hour DLC. Yeah, the untold truth of the industry is definitely that there is a lot of crunch, but it's something that I don't think most people should just kind of accept. And I know there are, Naughty Dog is one of those studios that is pretty bad at their crunch. We definitely we'll always crunch and everything, but it's something that I hope people don't feel like they need to do, as I do know a lot of people who don't crunch that much, or they'll maybe work an extra hour or two a day, to finish up this environment. Like, we were easily working 6 to 7 days a week, 100 hours a week. So it was pretty brutal to kind of get it done. It's also just kind of a lot of it is, your desire to, like, you're like, oh, I want to make the greatest thing, and you need to, like, make everything amazing, and then eventually you start to realize how unimportant that is. You really want to kind of focus in on those points of interest areas, those areas that are kind of key central areas where the players are going to go to. So even from working and crunching on this, it definitely taught me a lot about not needing to kind of put detail absolutely everywhere. Every environment that you make, you're always going to learn something, and you're always going to kind of just improve upon it. And get faster at different things. And yes, Red Dead had pretty insane kind of crunching as well. It was apparently even worse than what we did to kind of really finish up Lost Legacy here. They also had, basically Rockstar has, I think, like 8 studios, and they have everyone from those studios kind of helping out to kind of crunch for the last few months on a game like Red Dead or Grand Theft Auto. But they do, obviously make some amazing work, and Grand Theft Auto is the most sold game of all time. So if you're going to crunch once on a project, I guess that wouldn't be the worst thing. But crunch is a definitely terrible thing, and something that I wish would kind of get out of the industry. Clarence mentioned that he worked for a Japanese developer before. Their clock is from 9 a.m. to 3 a.m. Next day, 3 a.m. again. Yeah, that's always rough. And one thing about the whole like shipping bonus though, so not every studio gives shipping bonuses. Some studios like Rockstar and everything do give nice shipping bonuses and everything, but it's not common at every studio. So you do have to be aware of that. And when you are kind of going into a studio, you really want to kind of know kind of what their kind of crunch cycle is like. And, do they give shipping bonuses? Do they give royalties on their game? Royalties are very rare at a studio, but there are some studios who do, you do get royalties for the game, for however long you're working there. David mentioned he had like 6 to 8 weeks total of max, like 2 hours extra a day over the course of a year that they're working on. Yeah, so I definitely know a lot of people like that. I have friends over at Blizzard who have told me that like when they were crunching, crunch was an extra 2 hours for only 3 days a week for like 4 weeks to finish up Overwatch. Like they would force you to go home if you were trying to stay there too long. So some studios definitely have a much better handle on kind of keeping people from crunching, and making sure that you do have a nice kind of work-life balance, because you eventually get to a point where you are working so many hours that you're actually doing worse work, and you're actually kind of creating more problems and issues for yourself. And, you're just not going to be as kind of artistically on the ball or just kind of mentally there. And so you really got to find that balance. And you need to like, I always kind of think of it as you need to make sure that your leads kind of really know like, hey, I can't get this done in this amount of time. And I don't think that's a bad thing. We definitely brought that up with our leads, but they were brand new leads at the time. They were all trying to prove themselves. And it was kind of a big kind of clustery disaster in some respects. But, we're still happy with what we kind of were able to get out. Oh, and yes, definitely want to get to those last few questions. Sorry. It can be kind of easy to ramble. But yes, Houdini and World Machine, we don't use them as kind of core parts of our workflow. We are looking at new Houdini tools to try and bring in to kind of our pipeline, but nothing solid yet. Frank asked about kind of textile density. And so for our games, since they are third person, we go with a textile density of 512, like a tiling texture of 512 per meter. So every meter you have basically a 512 by 512. I think a lot of first-person shooter games, kind of like Battlefield, or like Call of Duty, are at 1K per meter and a half. I think it is. I'd have to check on that one. I'm not 100% sure. And then he also asked about painting custom meshes with the landscape material. Kind of showed that off, and we'll definitely be going over that. Lewis asked about landscape materials. Like, is it okay to use things like Megascan and Mixer to create your tiling landscape textures, or do you have to make them from Substance or like ZBrush or Photoshop? So yes, you can use Megascans and Mixer to create your textures. The one thing I do want to mention for that is I've never actually seen anyone kind of apply and get a job utilizing Megascan or Mixer textures. Kind of a warning there. I mean, I'm sure maybe people have, but oftentimes any studio that you're going to, they are going to want to see you be able to create textures yourself, either in Substance, um, ZBrush, or Photoshop. A big problem with things like Megascans and Mixer is that a studio has to pay for any of the Megascans you use, and not every studio wants to pay that kind of licensing fee. Whereas if you are kind of creating your own textures, then the studio is basically paying you to make those textures, not paying Megascans to use them. So that is one thing. I think for personal projects, it's totally fine to use things like Megascan and Mixer, because oftentimes for a lot of personal stuff, you're just trying to create really cool art. So that is the one thing. If you are not comfortable with using something like Substance or ZBrush to kind of create textures, then it's better to have an environment that looks great with some Megascans and Mixer textures. Generally, you are going to want to let people know when you kind of complete your scene, be like, hey, I utilize Megascans for a lot of my textures and everything. Otherwise, studios are going to think you made them yourself. And then when they give you like a texturing test, you're like, well, I made these out of Megascans. And they're going to be like, oh, well, too bad. So that is just the one thing. Again, I'm not sure, 100% sure if studios are just like, they won't hire you if you only use Megascan or Mixer, but I know at least at Naughty Dog, we have never even given, I'm pretty sure we've never given anyone a texture art test that applied with just Megascan and Mixer textures. So that is just a fair warning, but it is totally acceptable to do it for this class and everything. David had some questions. Are there any golden rules that you've picked up in your career for level layout and dressing a scene with organic elements? So, or like golden rules, there can be a lot of things. We'll definitely go over a lot of these kind of things in the class, but oftentimes some of the best will be kind of clumping up your details and assets. We'll definitely go over kind of clumping in week 8, not yet, no, 7, 8, week 8. We'll be kind of going over that when we're starting to really detail out our scenes, but making sure that you're kind of like clumping your assets together, keeping your scenes, keeping the details in concentrated areas where you want to draw the player to, not having basically just a gluttony of details spread out all over the place, because then it just becomes very noisy and it becomes really hard to read and understand what is going on and where you need to go as a player. Because not only are those details going to help draw you into any one given area, kind of design-wise, where you need to draw the player there, but it's also going to draw you artistically. You're going to be drawn to areas of high concentrations of detail or kind of a lack of detail in specific areas. And so finding that balance of kind of having enough detail, but to draw you along an environment is kind of what's important. Have we ever worked with SpeedTree that much as a part of the pipeline at Naughty Dog? So I've worked with SpeedTree just a little bit when we were kind of testing it out on Uncharted 4 early on. I think half of the trees for Uncharted 4 were made with a combination of a SpeedTree and then hand modeling and to kind of clean those assets up. We had 2 artists that were basically in charge of most of the trees in Uncharted 4. They kind of created, let's say, maybe 75% of them, as well as 75% of the foliage. And they use kind of a combination of SpeedTree to kind of get a good base, and then we would just kind of clean things up, since SpeedTree kind of gives very unoptimized results, and can sometimes be artistically limiting to maybe what we want to do. But if you want to use SpeedTree, that's fine. I always think it's kind of a good idea to kind of learn how to make a tree, or at least try to make your own tree when you are kind of building out an environment, because if you ever have to do something like a stylized tree or kind of anything whimsical in that regard, understanding how to build a tree is really helpful. As I don't know if speed tree can do anything stylized. At least I've never actually seen it. Maybe it can. What are the best methods of blending rocks and kit pieces into the terrain? So that will definitely go over. There are kind of like some shader techniques that we can utilize, but oftentimes it's really just disguising wherever you get kind of asset penetration in with kind of details. You want to be able to mask it with either, assets that have textures that kind of relate to the ground itself. So this rock pile here has a texture that is very similar to the kind of landscape texture that it's sitting on. So they kind of blend very well, using textures that kind of blend those assets together, using smaller assets to kind of cover up anywhere there is kind of Z fighting, or where one object is kind of penetrating into another. Again, like I have some big rock boulders here, some cliffs, they're kind of jammed into the terrain here. And I'm using the tiling textures that are on this large cliff. I'm using those tiling textures on this landscape as well, so that when I paint the landscape, the textures are very close to each other and they blend in really well, so you don't notice the kind of separation as much. There are also some extremely expensive shader techniques that kind of will blend any asset in with any kind of landscape you can use, but those are extremely expensive in terms of shader costs, and they definitely will hurt your frame rate quite a lot. And then the textile density, so we mentioned that with kind of like, for at least for Naughty Dog, we kind of go 512 per meter. And I know you asked also about kind of with things that are uniquely unwrapped, and how that kind of correlates with assets that are tiling. So oftentimes things that are kind of like uniquely unwrapped, like maybe a TV or whatever, generally you're going to be kind of trying to decide what the texture resolution should be based on, kind of how big the prop is. Generally props and small little assets are kind of always set at like 512. We always author our textures at 2K, and then we just down res wherever, like whenever we're publishing to the game, as we want to, make sure we always have the high resolution texture in case we need it for like a cinematic or if we need a higher resolution version. But oftentimes props and small little objects like TVs, maybe an air conditioning machine, a bicycle, are generally kind of set at around 512. And then, then if it's a really important object, then it might, it's looking too low res, then we kind of go with, a 1024. But a lot of times that stuff is kind of eyeballed a little bit. We don't have like a super hard firm thing where we need to make sure everything on screen is at the exact same pixel resolution, as that is just kind of way too hard. We tried it once and we were just like instantly like, nope, this is never going to work. So sometimes a lot of things are eyeballed a little bit. All right, and I think that is all the questions for this week. I know we ran like an extra 40 minutes, so sorry that it kind of went a little long. Hopefully everything was helpful for this class, and hopefully I didn't ramble along too much for it. But yeah, again, if you ever have any questions, make sure that you leave them here in the live Q&As and we can kind of go over them. If you have anything you want answered right away, just drop them down in the forums as well, so that I can see those and just kind of quickly answer them. So Kim asks, we block out the terrain in Unreal this week. How far outside the playable area do you suggest we sculpt it to still keep it contained, but look like the environment will continue past the area? So it really kind of depends on however big your space is. Usually I like to just give it a little bit of breathing room, because if you don't, then what can happen is, like for this little space, so I wanted to kind of try and demo that off. But basically I stopped the terrain right here for kind of like what a lot of people do for their playable space, when they kind of are like, okay, my scene is going to be composed like this. And then you build your environment and you didn't leave yourself any room in the background. If you ever turn around, you're like, I want to get a shot like from over here. well, then you just have this issue of like, literally there's nothing there. So I always like to just kind of make my terrain kind of large. It's easy to have just areas that kind of stretch on like this that are nothing, but they're just kind of there in the background, and having a tiling texture there, just in case, you know, if you're ever like, I'm taking a screenshot from here, you can kind of see something. You don't really need to kind of sculpt it up or detail it or texture it really well. As long as it's there, just in case you kind of are like, you know what, I want to kind of maybe finish out this area some other time in the future. It just gives you a little bit more extra breathing room. So it kind of just depends on however big your environment is and what you're building, but it's always nice to have that breathing room. And you're really not going to get any negative effects from having a large kind of map size. Like, I can't remember exactly how big this one is, but you know, like a player is like about that size, and this is, you know, pretty large. You can see I've got a lot of just dead space in this kind of demo area, but it just gives you a little bit more room to kind of like work with. All right, so I think we'll just kind of wrap that up for this week. Thanks everyone for coming out and sticking out for this Q&A. Really appreciate it. And again, super excited to see everyone's work in the coming weeks. Make sure all of you post on the forums as much as you can. You know, join the Discord, as it sounds like it's definitely going to be a great thing. But if you do have questions you want me to answer for the class, you know, you'll have to ask them here, as that is what CGMA wants for all the people that possibly don't want to join the Discord. All right, everyone, thanks so much for coming out. Have a great week, and I can't wait to see what all of you make for week 2.